December 22nd, 2006. The bright yellow and red signs were coming down. Inside, the shelves that once held the heartbeat of a generation were stripped bare. Employees locked the glass doors for the final time. After 46 years, the music stopped. From a billion-dollar empire to total silence. At its zenith, this wasn't just a record store, it was a cultural religion. Nearly 200 locations spanning the globe, $1 billion in annual sales. Midnight releases where thousands lined the block, rubbing shoulders with icons like Elton John and Bruce Springsteen in the aisles. It was a place where outcasts found community and employees practically lived the rock and roll dream. Yet, in just a few short years, this colossal empire completely unraveled. The legendary Sunset Strip location sat empty. The bustling aisles were replaced by courtrooms and liquidation banners. How does a cultural institution, armed with absolute consumer loyalty and seemingly endless cultural capital, fall apart so quickly? The death of this retail titan wasn't just about the rise of the internet or teenagers downloading MP3s. That is only the surface of the story. Beneath the neon signs lay a deadly cocktail of catastrophic debt, corporate arrogance, and a blinding refusal to face reality. This is the story of Tower Records, a tragedy of how an empire that built its foundation on rebellion was ultimately crushed by its own refusal to change. Sacramento, California, 1941. The world was at war, and the American retail landscape was entirely utilitarian. People went to stores to buy exactly what they needed: groceries, hardware, medicine, and then they went home. But inside a modest pharmacy on Broadway called the Tower Cut Rate Drugstore, owned by Clayton Solomon, a subtle revolution in consumer behavior was about to take place. Clayton's teenage son, Russ Solomon, was looking for a way to make a little extra pocket money. He noticed that the local jukebox distributor would periodically come into the drugstore to swap out the old, played-out 78 RPM records for fresh hits. The old records were practically considered garbage. Russ had an idea. He asked his father if he could set up a small rack in the corner of the pharmacy to sell these used jukebox records for 3 cents apiece. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The records sold out almost as fast as Russ could stock them. As he watched customers bypass the aspirin and greeting cards to rifle through the wooden bins of used music, the young Solomon realized something profound about consumer psychology. Music was not merely a commodity, it was an emotional necessity, a fundamental part of human identity. Customers didn't just want music, they craved it. They would spend their last dime on a song that made them feel something. This early observation would become the bedrock of an empire. Over the next decade, through the post-war economic boom and the rise of rock and roll, the record rack inside the Tower Cut Rate drugstore grew into a full-fledged department. As formats evolved from heavy shellac 78s to 45s, and eventually long-playing LPs, the music section began to swallow the floor space of the pharmacy. By the late 1950s, the drugstore was generating far more revenue from vinyl records than it ever did from prescription medications. The walls of the pharmacy could no longer contain Russ Solomon's ambition. In 1960, armed with a $5,000 loan from his father and a vision that bordered on obsession, Russ Solomon opened his first standalone record store on Watt Avenue in Sacramento. He named it Tower Records, borrowing the moniker from his father's drugstore, which itself was named after the iconic Tower Theater located in the same building. From the very first day, the Watt Avenue store broke every established rule of retail. At the time, standard department stores only stocked the top 40 hits, whatever was playing on the radio. If you wanted a niche blues album, a classical symphony, or an obscure jazz quartet, you had to special order it and wait weeks. Solomon's strategy was radically different. He wanted everything. The concept was simple but staggering in its execution. If a piece of music was recorded and pressed onto vinyl, Tower Records would have it in stock. It was the invention of the deep catalog physical retail model. But inventory alone does not build a cultural institution. Solomon understood that to create an unparalleled shopping experience, the environment had to be as authentic as the music itself. Instead of hiring professional retail clerks and forcing them into crisp, identical uniforms, Solomon hired the obsessives. He hired the kids who spent all day listening to garage rock, the jazz aficionados, the classical music scholars. He empowered them to run their departments however they saw fit. This decision fundamentally shifted the retail paradigm from a purely transactional interaction to an experiential one. The clerks weren't just cashiers, they were curators, tastemakers, and guides. They played whatever music they wanted over the store's massive sound system, often exposing customers to entirely new genres. There was no dress code. Tattoos, long hair, and band t-shirts were the unofficial uniform. Tower Records didn't feel like a store. It felt like a clubhouse. By intuitively applying a deep understanding of audience engagement and community building, Solomon created a space where people didn't just come to shop. They came to hang out, to discover, and to belong. The Watt Avenue location was a massive success, operating with a level of chaotic, beautiful energy that the retail world had never seen. The formula was perfected. The blueprint was drawn. But for Tower Records to transform from a successful local business into a global religion, it needed a much bigger stage. The counterculture movement was brewing just a couple of hours down the highway, and San Francisco was calling. In 1968, the quiet streets of Sacramento could no longer contain the relentless energy Russ Solomon had unleashed. He looked 2 hours west to San Francisco, a city pulsating with a counterculture revolution, where the echoes of the Summer of Love still reverberated through the neighborhoods. Tower Records opened its second location at the corner of Columbus Avenue and Bay Street. It was a massive 8,000 square foot cavern of sound. The timing was immaculate. Rock and roll was rapidly transitioning from disposable 3-minute pop singles to ambitious, album-oriented art. Consumers didn't just want a catchy chorus, they wanted the entire record, the gatefold artwork, the liner notes, and the experience. Tower San Francisco had it all. But the true coronation of the Tower Records empire happened 2 years later, in 1970, when the iconic yellow and red neon lit up the Sunset Strip in Los Angeles. If San Francisco was the soul of the 1960s music revolution, Los Angeles was its booming, glamorous, and highly lucrative heart. The Sunset location didn't just sell the culture, it immediately became the epicenter of it. It was the largest record store in the United States, a sprawling fortress boasting hundreds of thousands of titles that dwarfed any competitor. Tower Records fundamentally changed the clock of American retail. At the time, standard stores locked their doors at 5 or 6 in the evening. Tower stayed open until midnight, 365 days a year. This single operational decision transformed the space from a place of commerce into a nocturnal sanctuary. For teenagers, insomniacs, touring musicians, and the generally restless, Tower was the ultimate destination. On a Tuesday night at 11:30 p.m., the aisles would be packed. The distinct scent of shrink wrap and cardboard mixed with patchouli and cigarette smoke drifting from the parking lot. The deep bins of vinyl were illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights, while the store's colossal sound system pumped out whatever the clerk on duty felt like playing. Those clerks were the true architects of the Tower experience. Solomon famously operated on the philosophy of letting the inmates run the asylum. There was no corporate dress code. There were no mandated market-tested playlists handed down from a sanitized corporate headquarters. The employees were hired strictly for their obsessive, encyclopedic knowledge of music. They were the punks, the metalheads, the jazz purists, and the classical elitists. They decorated their own sections, managed their own inventory, and aggressively recommended obscure bands to bewildered but curious shoppers. They were intimidatingly cool, yet entirely approachable if a customer simply showed a willingness to listen. Because of this fierce, unapologetic authenticity, Tower Records on the Sunset Strip became a mandatory pilgrimage for the biggest stars on the planet. It was an open secret that Elton John, who reportedly spent thousands of dollars a week at the store, would pull up in his limousine before the doors officially opened on Tuesday mornings to buy every new release. Bruce Springsteen, David Bowie, John Lennon, and Prince could be spotted casually flipping through the bins, rubbing shoulders with awestruck fans. Touring bands would demand that their buses stop at Tower Records in whatever city they were passing through. To have your record displayed in the front window of the Sunset Strip store meant you had officially made it. You were part of the canon. By the 1980s, the physical music medium was transitioning. The vinyl record gave way to the cassette tape, and soon after, the shiny, indestructible promise of the compact disc. Rather than hurting Tower, these format shifts only fueled its explosive growth. Customers were rushing to the stores to repurchase their entire vinyl collections on CD, pumping unprecedented rivers of cash into the company's registers. Tower Records was no longer just a California phenomenon. It was a lifestyle brand, expanding rapidly across the United States, cementing the slogan, "No music, no life," into the minds of millions. It was a flawless run, a utopian vision of retail where passion dictated commerce and the cash registers never stopped ringing. But absolute, uninterrupted success breeds a very specific kind of blindness. The executives back in Sacramento, surrounded by platinum plaques, celebrity endorsements, and seemingly endless revenue, began to believe their own mythology. They believed that because they were Tower Records, because they literally owned the culture, they were immune to the fundamental laws of business gravity. They assumed the party would last forever, and that arrogant assumption was about to lead them to light the fuse on a catastrophic financial bomb. By the mid-1990s, Tower Records was no longer merely a prominent retail chain. It was an undisputed global juggernaut, a colossal monument to the profitability of physical media. The industry-wide transition from vinyl records and cassette tapes to the compact disc had created an unprecedented, seemingly endless windfall. CDs were cheaper to manufacture than vinyl, less prone to damage, and crucially, they could be sold at a significantly higher retail price. Consumers across the world were happily paying up to $18 for a single album, and Tower Records, with its vast floor space and deep catalog strategy, was perfectly positioned to capture the absolute peak of this retail boom. The ambition in the boardroom in West Sacramento shifted from dominating the American market to colonizing the globe. Tower Records embarked on an aggressive, wildly expensive campaign of international expansion. The iconic yellow and red signage began to illuminate the most expensive and highly trafficked commercial real estate on the planet. They opened a massive flagship store in London's Piccadilly Circus, a multi-story fortress of music that instantly became a landmark. They expanded deep into South America, opening sprawling locations in Buenos Aires and Bogota. They pushed into the Middle East, setting up shop in Tel Aviv. And most notably, they conquered Japan, building an awe-inspiring 9-story retail cathedral in the heart of Tokyo's Shibuya district. During this golden era, Tower Records was not just exporting American music, it was exporting the American concept of cool. To walk into a Tower Records in Tokyo or London was to experience the exact same chaotic, vibrating, hyper-curated energy as the original Sunset Strip location. The company was operating nearly 200 stores worldwide, employing thousands of dedicated, music-obsessed clerks. In 1999, the company reached a psychological and financial milestone that cemented its legendary status. Tower Records officially surpassed $1 billion in annual revenue. It was a staggering, monumental achievement for a company that had started as a small rack of used records in the corner of a neighborhood pharmacy. Inside the corporate headquarters, this billion-dollar threshold created a dangerous atmosphere of invincibility. The executive team, still led by the charismatic Russ Solomon, felt they had completely mastered the retail universe. They were the kingmakers of the music industry. Record label executives would fly to Sacramento to court Tower's buyers, begging them for premium placement on the end caps of their store aisles. The company threw lavish parties, funded extravagant marketing campaigns, and operated with a swagger that bordered on corporate hubris. Surrounded by platinum plaques and dizzying revenue reports, the leadership team believed that their brand was simply too big, too culturally significant, and too beloved ever to fail. However, beneath the polished veneer of a billion-dollar revenue stream lay a catastrophic, systemic financial vulnerability. Tower Records' explosive international and domestic growth was not being funded strictly by the cash it generated, nor was it financed by a meticulously planned initial public offering. Instead, this relentless territorial conquest was being fueled by a dangerous, rapidly compounding accumulation of debt. Building massive multi-story retail stores in the most expensive cities in the world required a staggering amount of upfront capital. The leases alone for spaces in Piccadilly Circus and Manhattan were astronomical, locking the company into strict, long-term financial obligations. To feed this insatiable beast of expansion, Tower Records turned to Wall Street. The fatal blow was struck in 1998, though its true impact wouldn't be felt for a few more years. To finance further expansion and consolidate existing loans, Tower Records issued $110 million in high-yield corporate bonds. In the financial world, these are often referred to as junk bonds, high-risk debt that carries heavy interest rates. This single boardroom decision fundamentally altered the reality of the company. Tower Records was no longer answering just to the music fans, the artists, or the record labels. They were now chained to bondholders and major banking institutions. These financial entities did not care about the cultural significance of the Sunset Strip store. They did not care that Elton John shopped there on Tuesday mornings, or that the clerks were renowned tastemakers. They only cared about one thing: the massive, inflexible interest payments that were due every single quarter. By taking on this monumental debt load, Tower Records had essentially placed a ticking time bomb under its own foundation. The entire financial structure of the company now relied on absolute, uninterrupted perfection. To survive the crushing weight of its $110 million bond issue, the company needed to maintain its exorbitant profit margins. They needed consumers to continue buying $18 CDs in massive volumes, month after month, year after year, forever. There was zero margin for error, zero room for an economic downturn, and absolutely no financial cushion to absorb a shift in consumer behavior. The executives in Sacramento had built a billion-dollar empire, but they had built it on a razor's edge. They assumed the music industry would remain frozen in the highly profitable landscape of the late 1990s. But the landscape was already shifting. A brutal war was looming on the horizon, and surprisingly, the first major threat to Tower's existence would not come from a computer screen or a digital download. It was going to come from the sprawling, harshly lit aisles of suburban big-box discount stores, where music was about to be weaponized in a retail bloodbath. The new millennium was rapidly approaching, and while the executives in West Sacramento were distracted by their international conquests and the staggering pressure of their corporate bond issue, a different kind of war was brewing right in their own backyard. It wasn't a war of culture, aesthetic purity, or musical superiority. It was a ruthless, mathematically cold war of retail attrition, and the primary battlefield was the American suburb. For decades, Tower Records had operated on a simple, largely unchallenged economic premise. They sold music at a premium price, because they offered an immersive experience and an exhaustive selection that simply could not be found anywhere else. Consumers willingly paid $18 or even $19 for a newly released compact disc because Tower was the definitive, reliable destination. But as the 1990s progressed into their twilight, massive big box retailers like Best Buy, Circuit City, Target, and Walmart began to fully recognize the incredible foot traffic generating power of the physical CD. These corporate leviathans did not care about music as an art form. They did not care about the sanctity of the album sequencing, nor did they care about curating a deep catalog of obscure Delta blues, vintage jazz, or avant-garde European electronica. To the executives at Best Buy and Walmart, the latest blockbuster album by NSYNC, Britney Spears, or Metallica was simply a utility, a shiny, culturally relevant plastic lure meticulously designed to drag millions of consumers through their sliding glass doors. This realization birthed the era of the loss leader strategy in physical music retail. A massive big box store would leverage its monumental buying power to purchase a newly released, highly anticipated CD at wholesale cost, perhaps $11 or $12 per unit. Instead of marking it up for a standard retail profit, they would intentionally price it at $9.99, boldly advertising the massive discount on the front pages of Sunday newspaper circulars across the country. They were willingly and intentionally losing $1 or $2 on every single CD sold. To a traditional specialized record store, this strategy was absolute financial suicide. But to a sprawling retail giant like Target or Best Buy, it was a brilliantly calculated, highly effective marketing expense. The logic was foolproof. If a customer came in specifically to buy the heavily discounted Backstreet Boys album, there was a high statistical probability they would not walk out with just the CD. While wandering the cavernous, harshly lit aisles, they would likely pick up batteries, a toaster, video games, or perhaps even a $1,000 television set. The massive profit margins on electronics, appliances, and home goods completely absorbed and erased the deliberate losses taken on the music department. Tower Records, however, did not sell refrigerators. They did not sell washing machines, microwaves, or flat-screen televisions. They exclusively sold music, books, and videos. Their entire corporate infrastructure, their massive employee payroll, and their towering leases in prime urban real estate were entirely dependent on turning a healthy, sustainable profit on the media itself. The impact of this predatory, aggressive pricing strategy on Tower Records was immediate, tangible, and financially devastating. The famed deep catalog, the very soul and foundation of the Tower Records philosophy, was incredibly expensive to maintain. Stocking hundreds of thousands of niche albums that might only sell 1 or 2 copies a year required massive amounts of physical floor space. To financially subsidize the immense cost of keeping these obscure, sheer slow-moving titles in stock for the purists, Tower absolutely relied on the high-margin, high-volume sales of the top 40 blockbuster hits. Suddenly, that critical revenue stream evaporated. The casual consumer quickly realized they didn't need to drive out of their way to the neon-lit Tower Records on the Sunset Strip and pay $18 for the new Shania Twain album when they could effortlessly grab it for $10 while buying their weekly groceries at Walmart. A terrifying new consumer behavior began to visibly emerge on the store floors. True music fans would still flock to Tower Records on a Friday night. They would still wander the seemingly endless aisles, soak in the rebellious atmosphere, spend hours at the listening stations, and talk to the incredibly knowledgeable clerks to discover emerging underground artists. But when it came time to actually make a purchase of a major release, they would simply leave empty-handed, drive down the street to a big box retailer, and buy the heavily discounted CD there. Tower Records was slowly, painfully being transformed from a highly profitable retail empire into a massive, free, interactive museum of music. The executives in Sacramento watched their market share for hit records plummet, yet they remained paralyzed by a toxic mixture of corporate denial and operational rigidity. Because of the crushing, inflexible interest payments required by their $110 million debt load, they simply could not afford to lower their retail prices to compete with the big boxes. They were financially trapped in a corner of their own making. Instead of aggressively pivoting their strategy or completely restructuring their business model, management doubled down on their arrogance. They publicly dismissed Best Buy and Walmart as sterile, soulless warehouses that true, dedicated music fans would eventually reject. They genuinely, fatally believed that the authentic Tower experience was powerful enough to completely overcome basic consumer economics. They thought loyalty to the culture would always trump the simple allure of saving $8 on a CD. They were catastrophically wrong. The big box bloodbath effectively severed Tower's primary financial lifeblood, completely draining the cash reserves they desperately needed to service their mounting debt and maintain their sprawling real estate footprint. Yet, as brutal as the big box war was, it was only the first wave of an impending destruction. A far more insidious, invisible threat was quietly forming in college dorm rooms across the country. A technological revolution that wouldn't just undercut their prices, but would completely dismantle the concept of the physical music format itself. While the brutal price wars with big box retailers were actively bleeding Tower Records of its crucial mainstream revenue, a completely different, entirely invisible catastrophe was germinating in the shadowy corners of the early internet. In June 1999, an 18-year-old college student named Sean Fanning released a seemingly innocuous piece of software called Napster. It was a peer-to-peer file-sharing application designed specifically to allow users to easily find and trade MP3 audio files across the web. To the traditional retail industry, a digital file seemed abstract, lacking the physical weight, the glossy artwork, and the tangible presence of a compact disc. But from a consumer psychology standpoint, Napster was a cataclysmic disruption. It fundamentally rewired how an entire generation perceived the value, ownership, and consumption of music. For decades, the music industry, and by extension Tower Records, had relied on a specific psychological contract with the consumer: the bundled album. If a teenager heard a highly produced, infectious pop single on the radio, they could not simply buy that one song. They were essentially forced to purchase the entire $18 CD, which often contained the one-hit single and 11 tracks of mediocre filler. Consumers had silently accepted this friction because there was no alternative. Napster instantly annihilated that friction. It unbundled the album, allowing users to search for, download, and hoard exactly what they wanted, track by individual track. But the true danger of Napster wasn't just that the music was free, it was the absolute lack of physical barriers. To buy a CD at Tower Records required getting into a car, driving through traffic, finding parking, navigating the store, and waiting in line at a cash register. Napster required a few clicks of a mouse from a dorm room chair. It offered an intoxicating level of immediate gratification that a physical retail environment could never hope to match. Within months of its launch, millions of college students and tech-savvy teenagers had downloaded the software. Hard drives were rapidly filling up with thousands of pirated songs. Blank recordable CDRs became the new currency of the schoolyard, completely bypassing the cash registers of legitimate record stores. The highly profitable physical media ecosystem that Tower Records relied upon to service its crushing corporate debt was suddenly being bypassed entirely. The empire was not just losing sales, it was losing its relevance to the very demographic that had once worshipped at its altar. Faced with this unprecedented existential threat, The executive leadership at Tower Records retreated into a fortress of profound denial. Surrounded by decades of historical success and millions of physical discs sitting in their massive warehouses, they fundamentally misread the psychological shift occurring in their consumer base. Russ Solomon and his executive team publicly scoffed at the concept of downloaded music. They loudly, repeatedly insisted that the MP3 was a passing fad, a low-quality novelty that true music fans would eventually reject. They held firmly to the romanticized belief that people inherently desired the physical artifact. They argued that consumers wanted to hold the plastic jewel case, read the liner notes, and collect the artwork. They believed that the deeply ingrained sensory experience of browsing a record store was an unbreakable cultural habit. This was a catastrophic miscalculation. While a niche group of purists still valued the physical object, the vast majority of the consuming public decided that the true value of music lay entirely in the audio data itself. Once that audio could be decoupled from the plastic disc became utterly worthless. Instead of rapidly investing in digital infrastructure or attempting to create their own legitimate online platform, Tower Records allied themselves firmly with the major record labels in a reactionary legal crusade. They supported the Recording Industry Association of America, RIAA, in its aggressive lawsuits aimed at shutting down Napster and, disastrously, suing individual consumers for downloading files. While the courts eventually ruled in favor of the music industry and forced Napster into bankruptcy in 2001, it was a hollow, entirely meaningless victory. The psychological dam had already burst. The genie could not be forced back into the $18 jewel case. Even after Napster vanished, a dozen other file-sharing networks, LimeWire, Kazaa, BitTorrent, immediately sprang up to take its place. Tower Records found itself alienated from its most vital audience. By clinging desperately to a dying format and ignoring the shifting desires of the market, they transformed from a rebellious cultural pioneer into a stagnant, conservative corporate dinosaur. They were bleeding cash, suffocating under a mountain of junk bond debt, and staring at increasingly empty store aisles. And the final fatal blow to their physical empire was about to be delivered by a company that didn't just understand the digital revolution, but brilliantly commercialized it. As the early 2000s unfolded, the landscape of music consumption was shifting with terrifying speed. The chaotic, pirated free-for-all of Napster had conditioned the public to expect music on demand. But it was still a relatively fringe activity, burdened by legal risks and clunky interfaces. The true, fatal blow to physical retail required a bridge between the digital frontier and the mainstream consumer. That bridge arrived in October 2001, when Steve Jobs stood on a stage in Cupertino and pulled a sleek, white, rectangular device from his pocket. It was the iPod. Its marketing promise was devastatingly simple: 1,000 songs in your pocket. For Tower Records, the iPod represented an existential crisis that they were entirely unequipped to handle. The device inherently devalued the physical artifact of the compact disc. It completely erased the need for massive, sprawling retail spaces filled with plastic cases. Why would a consumer navigate traffic, find parking on the Sunset Strip, and pay $18 for an album when they could legally and effortlessly carry their entire music library in their pocket? The crisis deepened exponentially in April 2003 with the launch of the iTunes Music Store. Apple brilliantly negotiated with the major record labels to sell individual digital tracks for 99 cents. It was the absolute realization of what Napster had initiated, the permanent unbundling of the album, but wrapped in a seamless, entirely legal, and highly profitable digital storefront. Consumers could now cherry-pick the exact songs they wanted, completely bypassing the bloated $18 physical CD. The friction of purchase was reduced to a single click. Faced with this monumental paradigm shift, the leadership at Tower Records retreated into a catastrophic state of denial. Instead of aggressively pivoting their business model or attempting to dominate the digital space with their immense brand recognition, they clung desperately to the past. Russ Solomon and his executive team publicly downplayed the threat of Apple and digital downloads. They maintained a stubborn, romanticized conviction that true music aficionados would never abandon the tangible experience of browsing a physical store. They believed that holding a CD booklet, appreciating the cover art, and physically interacting with the product were sacred, unbreakable habits. This corporate arrogance bled into their digital strategy. When the company finally attempted to build an e-commerce presence with TowerRecords.com, the effort was half-hearted and chronically underfunded. Rather than treating their website as the undeniable future of the company, the executives viewed it merely as a supplementary mail-order catalog. The website was clunky, difficult to navigate, and offered absolutely no digital download options. In a digital gold rush, Tower Records was still trying to sell pickaxes via snail mail. They fundamentally missed the beat, surrendering the entire digital revolution to Apple and Amazon without putting up a meaningful fight. While the executives philosophized about the sanctity of physical media, a much darker, immediate reality was unfolding in the accounting department back in Sacramento. The financial time bomb that the company had armed in 1998 was finally detonating. The $110 million in high-yield junk bonds they had issued to fund their reckless global expansion had matured, and the staggering interest payments were bleeding the company's cash reserves dry. Tower Records was suddenly trapped in a lethal financial vice. On one side, their core revenue stream was evaporating. The big box retailers were mercilessly undercutting their prices on blockbuster hits, while iTunes and piracy were simultaneously siphoning away the youth demographic. Foot traffic in their colossal retail stores was plummeting. The aisles, once packed with energetic, music-obsessed crowds until midnight, were becoming uncomfortably quiet. On the other side of the vice, the Wall Street banks and bondholders were merciless. The massive interest payments required absolute perfection in sales, but sales were cratering. The company was hemorrhaging tens of millions of dollars every quarter. They simply did not have the liquid cash required to service their colossal debt and maintain the massive overhead of their prime real estate leases in cities like New York, London, and Tokyo. The panic began to spread through the supply chain. Record labels and distributors, sensing the impending financial collapse of the retail giant, started altering their terms. For decades, Tower Records had operated on credit, receiving shipments of CDs and paying the vendors months later. Now, nervous distributors began demanding cash on delivery. Some labels quietly stopped shipping major new releases entirely, terrified that they would never see a dime if Tower filed for bankruptcy. Inside the stores, the atmosphere shifted from vibrant rebellion to quiet desperation. The famed deep catalog, the vast, encyclopedic inventory that defined the Tower experience, began to thin out. Gaps appeared on the shelves. Employees who had once viewed their jobs as a permanent lifestyle began whispering about bounced checks and missing inventory. The executives had completely lost control of the narrative. They were no longer the rebellious kingmakers of the music industry. They were corporate hostages, suffocating under a mountain of debt, hopelessly watching the digital revolution pass them by. The music hadn't stopped just yet, but the empire was on life support and the banks were preparing to pull the plug. By early 2004, the suffocating pressure of the 1998 junk bond debt could no longer be managed with accounting maneuvers or optimistic revenue projections. The math was absolute, and it was entirely unforgiving. The massive big box retailers had successfully stripped away the profitable, high-volume mainstream album sales, while iTunes and digital piracy were rapidly eroding whatever young demographic remained. The company was bleeding cash at an unsustainable rate, unable to simultaneously pay its vendors, maintain its expensive global leases, and service the staggering interest on its corporate bonds. In February 2004, the inevitable finally occurred. Tower Records, the once invincible billion-dollar titan of music retail, officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. To the general public, the doors remained open. The neon signs stayed lit, and the music continued to play over the store speakers. But behind the scenes, the filing triggered a brutal, fundamental shift in the company's DNA. Chapter 11 is designed for restructuring. It allows a dying company to shed some of its immediate debt burdens in exchange for giving its creditors massive equity and control. For Tower Records, this meant that the banks and the bondholders, institutions entirely devoid of musical sentimentality or cultural reverence, effectively took ownership of the empire. They seized an 85% equity stake in the company. This financial restructuring required a devastating human toll. The legendary corporate culture, Fasosa Collegiere culture, famously built on the philosophy of letting the music-obsessed inmates run the asylum, was systematically dismantled. The banks demanded ruthless efficiency. Corporate turnaround specialists, entirely unfamiliar with the nuances of independent record labels or the importance of deep catalog curation, were brought in to stop the financial bleeding. The most tragic casualty of this corporate takeover was the founder himself. Russ Solomon, the charismatic visionary who had started selling used jukebox 78s in his father's Sacramento drugstore over 4 decades earlier, was essentially forced to step away from the helm of his own creation. The patriarch of the vinyl religion had lost his congregation to the accountants. The new leadership immediately began slashing costs, halting expansion, and desperately trying to modernize an infrastructure that was a decade behind the digital curve. For a brief moment, there was a glimmer of hope that the restructuring might work. A leaner, more disciplined Tower Records emerged from the first bankruptcy proceedings. But they were stepping out of the courtroom and back into a retail environment that was transforming at warp speed. By 2005, broadband internet was ubiquitous, Apple's iPod dominated the culture, and the physical CD was no longer just in decline, it was in free fall. The turnaround plan simply could not outpace the absolute collapse of the physical media market. The final fatal blow was dealt in August 2006. The restructuring had failed. The debt was still too high, the revenue was plummeting faster than anyone had modeled, and the banks were no longer willing to extend lifelines. Tower Records filed for bankruptcy a second time. But this was no longer a Chapter 11 restructuring. The company was put on the auction block. The ensuing bankruptcy auction, held in October 2006, was a tense, heartbreaking spectacle that would permanently seal the fate of the cultural institution. The auction essentially boiled down to 2 primary bidders, representing 2 vastly different outcomes for the thousands of employees and millions of loyal customers. On one side was Trans World Entertainment, the corporate parent of mall-based music chains like FYE and Sam Goody. Their intention was to buy the Tower Records brand, acquire its best-performing real estate, US Baums, and actually keep a significantly reduced version of the chain operating. It would be a shadow of its former glory, but the yellow and red signs would remain, and thousands of jobs would be saved. On the other side of the bidding war was Great American Group, a powerful, ruthless corporate liquidation firm. Great American Group had absolutely no interest in selling music, preserving culture, or keeping employees on the payroll. They specialized in buying dying retail chains, squeezing every last drop of capital out of the remaining inventory through aggressive going-out-of-business sales, selling the store fixtures, and permanently locking the doors. The future of Tower Records came down to a bitter, incremental bidding war in a Delaware bankruptcy court. When the gavel finally fell, the outcome was decided by an agonizingly small margin. Trans World Entertainment's final offer was $133.8 million. Great American Group bid $134.3 million. For a mere difference of $500,000, the empire was handed over to the executioners. The news sent shockwaves through the music industry and the remaining staff. There would be no last-minute rescue. There would be no corporate turnaround. The Great American Group immediately assumed control and initiated a swift, merciless dismantling of the entire company. The cultural sanctuary that had hosted Elton John, Bruce Springsteen, and millions of rebellious teenagers was officially ordered to liquidate every single item inside its walls. The music was about to stop, and the final days were going to be a devastating, chaotic, and deeply emotional farewell. In October 2006, the vibrant, chaotic sanctuary of Tower Records was abruptly transformed into a retail graveyard. Great American Group, the liquidation firm that had won the bankruptcy auction by a razor-thin margin of $500,000, wasted absolutely no time. Their mandate was mathematically cold and ruthlessly efficient. Turn every single piece of physical inventory, every store fixture, every listening station, and every iconic neon sign into liquid cash as quickly as humanly possible. The legendary corporate culture, the legendary built over 4 decades of passion and rebellion, was instantly overridden by the brutal, unsentimental mechanics of a national going-out-of-business sale. Overnight, the atmosphere inside the remaining 89 United States locations completely evaporated. The towering, meticulously curated end caps that once proudly displayed the most anticipated new releases were draped in garish, blinding yellow and black banners screaming, "Everything must go," and "Store closing." The clerks, who had once been revered as the ultimate tastemakers, the encyclopedic guides to the musical universe, and the cultural gatekeepers of their respective cities, were reduced to the heartbreaking role of undertakers for their own community. They were forced to dismantle the very aisles they had spent years carefully curating. A cruel, deeply agonizing irony unfolded during these final 2 months. As the liquidation discounts grew steadily deeper, from 20% off to 40%, to eventually 70% and 80%, the massive crowds suddenly returned. The sprawling parking lots that had been distressingly empty for the past several years were abruptly packed with cars again. The aisles were flooded with people. But this was not the joyous, culturally hungry congregation of the 1990s. This was a massive crowd of retail vultures, enthusiastically picking over the carcass of a fallen giant. For the deeply devoted long-term employees, interacting with these liquidation crowds was a form of daily psychological torture. Customers who had happily abandoned Tower Records years earlier in favor of iTunes and Walmart were suddenly filling shopping carts with deeply discounted CDs, completely oblivious to the historical tragedy unfolding around them. The encyclopedic depth of the deep catalog, which had always been the company's crowning achievement, was aggressively shredded. The highly sought-after rarities, the expensive box sets, and the obscure European imports were the first items to be snatched up, leaving behind a depressing, disjointed inventory of unwanted classical compilations, broken jewel cases, and forgotten pop singles. As November bled into a bleak December, the physical deterioration of the stores violently mirrored the emotional devastation of the staff. Entire sections of the retail floor were roped off with caution tape as the inventory dwindled to nothing. The massive wooden racks, the specialized shelving units, and the high-end listening stations, the very architecture of the Tower experience, were tagged with cheap price stickers and sold off to the public. Customers weren't just buying the music anymore. They were buying the bones of the building. The famous Sunset Strip location in Los Angeles, which had operated for over 30 years as the undisputed epicenter of the American music industry, became a hollow, echoing shell. This was the sacred building where Elton John had spent entire mornings browsing, where Axl Rose had famously worked as a night manager in the video department before Guns N' Roses exploded, and where the biggest rock bands on Earth had caused massive traffic jams on Tuesday release nights. Now, it was just a massive, empty warehouse smelling of dust, floor wax, and stale memories. The vast community that had relied on Tower Records, the misfits, the artists, the insomniacs, and the teenagers desperately looking for an identity, suddenly realized they were losing far more than just a retail store. They were losing their clubhouse. They were losing a physical manifestation of their culture. The final, definitive chord was struck on December 22, 2006. Across the country, the remaining store managers were ordered to power down the registers and lock the glass doors for the last time. It was a chaotic, tearful, and profoundly surreal day. Employees gathered in the empty aisles, drinking cheap champagne out of paper cups, crying openly, and holding on to each other. Many of them had dedicated their entire adult lives to the company, believing deeply and unconditionally in the famous corporate mantra, no music, no life. Now they were walking out into a cold, uncertain digital future, carrying small cardboard boxes of personal belongings. At the Sunset Strip store, devoted fans gathered in the parking lot to hold impromptu candlelight vigils. They left bouquets of flowers, handwritten notes, unspooled cassette tapes, and guitar picks at the base of the towering neon sign. When the final manager turned the key in the lock and the bright interior lights went completely dark, an eerie, unprecedented silence fell over the massive building. The billion-dollar empire, the colossal cultural titan that had dictated the rhythm of the music industry for nearly half a century, was entirely gone. The records had all been sold, the shelves were stripped bare, and the music, finally, had stopped. But while the American empire had been thoroughly, completely erased from the retail landscape, a strange, undeniable echo was about to prove that Russ Solomon's original vision wasn't entirely flawed. It had simply been suffocated by corporate debt. Halfway across the world, the yellow and red signs were still burning bright, while the American retail landscape was entirely swept clean of the iconic yellow and red neon. A deeply surreal and magnificent irony was unfolding across the Pacific Ocean. If you were to walk out of the Shibuya train station in Tokyo today, you would not find an empty, decaying warehouse or a repurposed fitness center. Instead, you would be greeted by a towering 9-story monolith, pulsating with blinding neon, blasting the latest releases into the crowded streets. Tower Records is not dead. In Japan, it is spectacularly, undeniably alive. To understand this incredible geographical anomaly, one must look back at a crucial corporate maneuver that occurred just before the American empire completely collapsed. By 2002, the executives in West Sacramento were desperately trying to stave off their impending bankruptcy. They needed massive amounts of immediate cash to service their suffocating junk bond debt. To get that cash, they agreed to a management buyout of their incredibly profitable Japanese subsidiary. By selling off Tower Records Japan, the American parent company successfully severed the corporate umbilical cord. Tower Records Japan became an entirely independent, locally operated entity. When the American company was dragged into bankruptcy court and subsequently liquidated by the Great American Group in 2006, the Japanese stores were entirely insulated from the blast radius. They did not owe a single dime to the Wall Street bondholders who had aggressively dismantled the United States locations. But financial independence was only half of the survival equation. The true reason Tower Records Japan continues to thrive is rooted in a fundamental cultural difference in how the Japanese market values physical media. While the American consumer rapidly abandoned the compact disc for the invisible convenience of the MP3 and streaming services, the Japanese consumer retained a deep, unwavering reverence for the physical artifact. In Japan, purchasing music remained a deeply tangible experience. Elaborate album packaging, high-quality liner notes, and the collectability of physical media never lost their cultural cachet. Furthermore, the management team at Tower Records Japan stayed fiercely true to Russ Solomon's original vision. They continued to employ obsessive, highly knowledgeable staff. They maintained exhaustive, deep catalog inventories. They hosted massive, in-store live performances. They didn't just sell plastic discs. They successfully maintained the environment of a cultural clubhouse, proving that the original Tower Records business model was never inherently flawed. It had simply been suffocated in America by a toxic combination of corporate debt and a blinding refusal to adapt to a shifting market. Back in the United States, the brand essentially operated as a ghost for over a decade. The trademark was passed around, utilized occasionally to sell nostalgic t-shirts, but the retail presence was completely extinct. Then, in the fall of 2020, amidst a global pandemic that had completely shuttered what remained of physical retail, Tower Records quietly announced a return to the United States. It was not a triumphant return to the Sunset Strip. It was a digital resurrection. The brand was revived as an online-only storefront, capitalizing on the massive, unexpected resurgence in the popularity of vinyl records. They brought back the iconic yellow and red logo, the classic font, and the legendary slogan, "No music, no life." They offered digital listening parties and exclusive vinyl pressings. While the online revival proved that the brand still carried immense, undeniable emotional weight for millions of Americans, it also served as a melancholic reminder of exactly what had been lost. A website, no matter how beautifully designed, cannot replicate the distinct, intoxicating smell of floor wax, stale cigarette smoke, and shrink wrap. It cannot recreate the thrilling, serendipitous experience of flipping through a wooden bin at midnight and striking up a conversation with a stranger about an obscure punk band. When conducting the autopsy of the American Tower Records empire, it is far too easy to simply point the finger at Steve Jobs, Sean Fanning, and the unstoppable momentum of the internet. While digital disruption was the executioner, the company had already dug its own grave. The true tragedy of Tower Records was a catastrophic failure of leadership. Blinded by $1 billion in revenue, they arrogantly assumed they were invincible. They leveraged their soul to finance a reckless global expansion, strapping a bomb of high-yield debt to their chests. When the big-box discount stores and the digital revolution simultaneously attacked, they were completely financially paralyzed, unable to fight back or reinvent themselves. What disappeared in December 2006 was not just a chain of retail stores, it was the physical manifestation of American musical culture. Tower Records was a uniquely democratic space, a vibrant, chaotic sanctuary where teenagers, outcasts, and global superstars all walked the same aisles, bound by a shared, desperate need to hear something new. The neon signs have been dismantled, and the buildings have been repurposed, but for an entire generation of music fans, the silence left behind is still deafening. The story of Tower Records is often cleanly reduced to a simple cautionary tale about the internet destroying physical media. But that narrative misses the true, heavier weight of the tragedy. Empires of this magnitude do not collapse overnight simply because a new technology is introduced into the market. They crumble from within long before the final blow is ever struck. Tower Records didn't just fail to see the digital future, they actively chose to ignore it. Handcuffed by mountains of reckless corporate debt and blinded by the arrogance of their own historical success. They believed that because they had authored the culture of the 20th century, they were automatically guaranteed a monopoly on the 21st. But retail, at its highest form, is never just about the transaction. It is about community, identity, and shared experience. For over 4 decades, Tower Records operated as the great equalizer of American culture. It was a brightly lit, chaotic sanctuary where the lonely, the rebellious, the curious, and the famous could all gather under one massive roof, flipping through wooden bins at midnight in pursuit of a feeling. When those glass doors locked for the final time in December 2006, the United States didn't just lose a massive chain of discount CD stores. It lost a communal gathering space that the internet, for all of its infinite, frictionless convenience, has never been able to fully replicate. The towering yellow and red neon signs may be permanently gone, the buildings repurposed into fitness centers, pharmacies, or left as vacant lots, but the echo of what Tower Records represented still heavily resonates. It stands as a stark, unforgiving reminder that in business, nostalgia is a toxic strategy. A brand can be unconditionally loved by millions, deeply woven into the very fabric of a generation, and still completely vanish if it refuses to adapt to the cold reality of the present. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the rise and fall of one of America's most iconic retail giants. If you ever spent a Friday night flipping through the deep catalog bins at Tower Records, share your favorite find or memory in the comments below. Please subscribe and turn on notifications for more documentaries exploring the forgotten landscapes of American retail.